Hello. So we continue our discussion on the money supply, and in this part of the lecture, we are going to determine the money supply function. For doing that, we need first of all to determine what are the major participants which are involved in determination of the money supply. Of course, it's a central bank who is responsible for control for printing money in general. But besides the central bank, we could add two more players which determine how much money was going to be needed in the economy. So one of them is public, that is consumers and producers or companies and people who needs money, and then there's commercial banks. To sum up, all those three parts, all those three participants, they involve all the layers of a money creation system, as we have public, which needs money, then we have a central bank, which prints money, and we have commercial banks as intermediaries in all this process, how the money from the central bank reaches public. So we can start from the public part, as I believe that's the easiest one to understand, as we already spent half of the semester discussing on how much money do people need. And we talked about the decision of the people when we know that they have to spend some certain amount of money during, let's say, a month. So how we are gonna do with that? So whether we are going to keep everything in cash, or would they hold something in a bank, in a deposit card, or in a check account, and then they would just withdraw in case they need it, or maybe they can pay by card or by any other device, and so they don't need to withdraw cash, and etc. So we would do one more adjustment here. We would say that it's not only cash that we are talking about and that we are concerned about, but it's currency to deposit ratio. That is, what share of money people would hold as cash and what share they would put as a deposit. And looking at the function, which is written down here, you can see that all the factors are listed that we already discussed and we know. So we can say that this currency deposit ratio depends on changes on demand deposits, average yield on public's investment in bonds, interest rate on demand deposits, interest rate on time deposits, and it's why income and payments technology, what payments technology refer to the part what we call brokerage costs, which would illustrate how much, what is the cost of withdrawing. So I will see some major factors which could determine the currency deposit ratio. And what we are always concerned about is elasticities of the effects. And we could clearly say that when the interest rates, say on demand deposits increases, the currency deposit ratio is going to decrease as people will try to hold more money as deposit and less money as a cash. As payments technology improves, the ratio would decrease, as again, which would mean that it's cheaper to withdraw money, and it's also that maybe people don't even to withdraw at all, so they would have more deposits than cash. And we have income as one of the major factors here, which would say that as income increases, the currency to deposit ratio goes up as well. This could be explained by the fact that higher income leads to more expenditure in general, and so each time we're just spending more. And what we also learned that together with income growth, usually we have a better distribution of more even distribution of income, where more even distribution of income leads to higher demand for money or higher demand for cash. So this linkage between currency ratio and income says that currency ratio is procyclical, which means that during upturns in the economy, when economy is growing and income is increasing, people would demand more money and they would hold less deposits, while during recessions, people would decide to put more money on deposits and hold less in cash. And that's usually what we also observe in real life. So, talking about the demand which comes from public, I believe that's quite clear, as I mentioned that we actually spent already much time discussing it. We didn't talk at all about the role of commercial banks, and talking about the demand side. In money market, commercial banks doesn't play a very big important role. You just set the interest rates, and that's more or less all. But when we talk about money supply, about the mechanism, how the money from the central bank goes into public, we need also to define the role of the commercial banks here. And when we talk about the role of commercial banks, we need again to think about how much money commercial banks need or how much cash commercial banks need. And that's a tricky question because on one hand, we see commercial banks as intermediaries, as who just simply needs to collect deposits and lend them to the others. So the efficient bank is the one which takes and lends and tries to manage all the terms and amounts and everything else, so they have nothing inside left. How they have the most efficient. Um, it's not really correct because all commercial banks they have to have required reserves. Required reserves is a percentage on the deposits which commercial banks cannot lend. They need to keep it. This required reserves is set by the central bank, and it's set on purpose as a regulatory mechanism of commercial banks. So one thing that commercial banks have to have some money preserved inside, which we cannot lend. One more tick here that in Eurozone, the required reserves is 2% of all deposits, which means it's really very low. If central bank has more money, I'm sorry, commercial banks has more money than required reserves, we can see it as ineffective as, or we can call it excess reserves, which means that excess reserves is the amount of money which is over the required reserves, which are not needed for the commercial bank to hold, and they would be much more profitable if they just simply lend it. And that's what's the purpose of the excess reserves. They have to lend it in general. Besides those two types of reserves, we can define also free reserves. Free reserves is a bit different. It's on one hand like excess reserves because it's over required reserves. So it's something additional than required by the central bank. But this is amount of reserves with which commercial bank is not willing to lend and keeps it for safety or for the case if in or not for the case which keeps it in order to pay back the deposits for people who comes and asks. So we can say that when commercial banks receive deposits, they put some required reserves as a must. Then they have some money in cash for those people who would come this day, let's say, and withdraw their deposits so they could pay. And then if they have even more money, this is excess reserves. This is something that shows inefficiency and which the central bank should employ as soon as possible. So we can think that free reserves is some kind of ratio to deposits, as commercial bank probably knows more or less or have estimated what share of deposits is withdrawn each day, and so how much money, according to how much money we collected, we have to have in order to be liquid. And so this ratio we think could depend on three factors: average interest rate on banks' assets, average return on banks' assets, reserves, and central bank's discount rate. Central bank's discount rate also shows is one of the instrument of a monetary policy. When the central bank increases the discount rate, it means that it's going to be more expensive for the commercial bank to borrow from the central bank, just in case free reserves is not enough. And so in this case, the free reserves should be higher. If the discount rate is small or is decreasing, we would see free reserves decreasing as well, as commercial banks would know that they could actually borrow quite cheaply from the central bank, and so they might be more risky. So now we know what is a commercial bank. How does it behave? We know the demand for money which comes from the public. And so how could we know how much money the central bank should set? There are two types of money supply theories, or the ways we can look or determine the money supply function. And those money supply theories, we fall into two groups. One is mechanical theories and the other is behavioral theories. Mechanical theories are the ones which uses functions, which use identities. Identities, so the exact links that we observe between the factors and between indicators. So based on that, we can try to derive mechanical money supply function. So we can say, we've finished in the previous slide, so we can say that bank's reserves is the ratio proportion of the deposits it has. Remember, we said that this is free reserves to deposit ratio, but bank reserves is free reserves and the required reserves. So this is how much money the clever commercial bank should have, and this is linked with the deposits it receives. Based on Friedman and Schwartz, we can look how the money supply function is derived. Remember, we said that all the money is equal to the cash and deposits that comes from the public behavior, public function. But we know that part of it, money which are deposited, are actually again lended by the commercial banks, and so again goes back into the economy. And what matters is not entire deposit amount, but the one which is left in bank reserves. So the one which is not being lended to anyone. So replacing deposits with bank reserves, we could get M0 or monetary base. Monetary base is the one which is set by the central bank directly. And then in a very simple way, writing M equal to M, and then multiplying and dividing M by M0, we can write this on one hand very simple function, and then do the replacements in M and M0 based on what we know. And we can derive a final money supply function, which says that the quantity of money in the economy depends on the monetary base for sure, but it also has a multiplier. This component, what we have here, is money multiplier. I hope you heard about it before, which says that as the money moves into banking sector and is lended back again to the society, to the public, the quantity of money which we actually have multiplies. And so the central bank again needs to know this multiplication in order to set the monetary base correctly. So this mechanistical money supply function illustrates the decision of the central bank. We see that it sets the monetary base. We also see one of the components is bank reserves, which depends on the required reserves set by the bank, as well as discount rates set by the bank. So all these affect the multiplication process in the economy, and that at the end is the money supply in the economy that we have, which should meet the demand for money. Uh, Looking at the behavioral theories of money supply, we usually take into account the behavior of different participants in this process in order to determine the economic and non-economic determinants of a variable being used. So they do not only look at what factors do we have, but also will look at what are the factors of those factors, or what are determinants of those factors as well. So the behavioral theory, money supply based on the behavioral theory is way longer function, as you see, with way more factors here. As you see, we don't get that exact function or equation, as we don't know the exact results, we do not know the exact links, as this depends on particular behavior of particular participant. But in general, we see that the factors involved are very similar with the previous one. Um, okay, so we can look at what does the estimate say to us, or what are the elasticities, what are the linkages between money supply and different factors. And the first question, it's not easy to answer this question because the results, as you see in this table, depends on what do we choose, what indicator do we choose for the money aggregate. Usually there might be two options, M1 and M2, where I want to remind you that M1 is cash and demand deposits, where M2 is M1 plus time deposits. So looking at the results, we can see that in case of M1, the only positive factor is interest rate on demand deposits, which makes it very logical, meaning that if interest rates on demand deposits increases, people would simply have more demand deposits, and that's why M1 is going to be higher. All the other interest rates, all the other factors have a negative effect on M1, which means that people would simply switch to other type of financial assets instead of holding demand deposits. In case of M2, the situation is different. We see a positive effect of the interest rate of time deposits, which is again logical, meaning that as M1 includes time deposits, so higher interest rates of time deposits motivates people to put more money in time deposits, and so M1 increases. We also see the same results as in one case with excess reserves and central bank discount rate, which in general changes the behavior of commercial banks. The question marks in terms of the effect of interest rate on demand deposits and interest rate on bonds indicates that the linkage is unknown, or the effects are unknown, and that again could be explained maybe by the fact that what is M1 and what is M2 might be very different in different countries, because okay, we may find different instruments in different countries, and then how do we group what instrument is M1 and what instrument is M2 might be very sensitive. So also those different definitions and different way of calculating of M1 and M2 can give slightly different results. That's what makes it difficult to determine the effects. The last issue to consider is the empirical findings on lags in money supply function. We talked much about lags in monetary policy, but now what does the empirical findings say? We see that impact elasticities are significantly lower than the equilibrium ones, indicating that the adjustments take longer than 1 quarter. So, which means that if any of the money supply factors changes, the money supply, it would take at least or more than 1 quarter for the money supply to react. So there is a time lag, first of all, though it might be not that long, like a bit longer than 3 months, but maybe not very much longer. The second finding says that the money supply has positive interest elasticities each month through the first 18 months for which the elasticities were reported, which says that the changes in the money supply changes interest elasticities. Uh, okay, I'm sorry, if the changes of interest have a positive effect on money supply, but these effects last more than 18 months. They start immediately, but their effect lasts for very long. So again, these empirical findings proves this suggestion on time lags that we may see in monetary policy.